Greetings, sisters and brothers, comrades, friends. Welcome to African History Club, episode 52. I'm your host, Milton Alimadi. I want to thank all supporters of this podcast. So, as I said in my previous podcast, today I will focus on the Russia-Ukraine war and the contradictions for Africa. I want to start with the first contradiction, the anti-African racism that we all saw in the initial stages of this conflict when everybody was trying to get out of the country. You all recall the scenes of Africans being pushed away, prevented from boarding the trains that were getting people out of danger, allowing them to flee into neighboring countries, including Poland. As one African student from Nigeria said, we were told whites first, and then Indians, meaning Indians who are also studying or working in Ukraine, and then Africans. Obviously, this was appalling. This was disgusting. This was reprehensible. I don't need to describe it in any other way. And of course, for Pan-Africans, this brings back all the memories of global anti-African racism. Whenever there's conflict, whenever there's issues where Africans are scapegoated. For example, you recall at the initial stages of the COVID pandemic, when in China, at one point, African immigrants, African students, Africans who have businesses in China and live in China were being scapegoated and targeted and assaulted and denied accommodation or being expelled from their apartments and being accused of somehow being responsible for resurgence of COVID-19 in China. So going back to the Ukraine conflict, what position is an African supposed to take? What position? Think about it. You may even sympathize with Ukraine as a country that is victim of an invasion, a war of an aggression from a much powerful country. Of course, there are many issues involved. The issue that the United States and its allies are using Ukraine in its proxy war with Russia. Obviously, the issue of Ukraine possibly joining NATO is of major concern to Russia. United States and the West trying to diminish that is a major factor in this conflict. But nonetheless, there's no denying that Ukraine is victim of a war of aggression, invasion, people being killed, property being destroyed, people living under terror conditions when bombs and missiles are being dropped. But then as an African, when we see the anti-African, anti-Black racism, how are we supposed to feel? Outrage about the conduct toward Africans, but sympathy at the same time that this country is victim of a war of aggression? Not many people are put in that type of situation. And that was only one part of it. Even the ones who were lucky to eventually get out of the country ended up being locked up in detention centers in neighboring countries, including Poland. While, on the other hand, Europeans who are able to get away from the conflict in Ukraine find prepaid Airbnb apartments waiting for them. So how is an African supposed to feel toward Ukraine? So let's go even further. when it was subsequently revealed that Ukrainian embassies in African countries were putting up notices on their Facebook pages trying to recruit young Africans from African countries to go and fight as mercenaries against Russians in Ukraine. Go back and fight on behalf of the same country where they were experiencing anti-Black, anti-African racism and hostility. You know, no matter how we see it, it boils down to one thing: being a dependent peripheral country in the global system. And that is the position that most African countries find themselves in. How else can you explain this? But of course, for me personally, when it comes to issues of racial hostility and racism, it's a big issue because, after all, it's something that I've devoted many years of my life studying. And as many of you know, it's the subject of my book, Manufacturing Hate: How Africa Was Demonized in Western Media, which accounts for the universal anti-Africa, anti-Black hostility that is pervasive in all parts of the world. But that is not the focus of today's podcast. Let me now move to another contradiction. And this is where I also really take issue with the corporate media and really show how they are a danger to global peace and stability. So the oversaturation of the Ukraine war, the coverage by the major corporate media, what are they meant to do? A number of things. Number one, to generate mass global sympathy and empathy for the victims of the war of aggression in Ukraine. But at what cost? Here are some of the costs. Totally ignoring and neglecting the genocidal war against Yemen being conducted by Saudi Arabia with United States assistance. So that war is now getting no coverage at all. But of major concern for this podcast are the conflicts in African countries. So, for example, let's look at the war in Ethiopia. You would be excused if you've not heard up to now that last week there was actually major development. There was a ceasefire announcement in this war that's going on to 17 months now. Yes, there was a ceasefire announcement, but it's gotten virtually no coverage at all. And why is coverage important? Coverage puts pressure on all the combatants to do the right thing and abide by what they've agreed to do. So in the case of this conflict in Ethiopia, there's been a promise to lift the suffocating and deadly embargo against the Tigray region, which has been embargoed for months, meaning there's no adequate food supplies getting through, no medical relief supplies getting through, resulting in a situation of famine. Because during the early stages of the war, farmers were uprooted from the land and the food storage destroyed, meaning without relief supplies coming through to that region, people are facing mass starvation deaths. So it's very critical to have coverage of that conflict to make sure that that embargo and siege is lifted. But that will not happen so long as global corporate media want the entire world to believe that the only conflict worth focusing on now is the Russian war on Ukraine. Another critical conflict in an African country that you rarely hear about is the ongoing war against the English-speaking region of Cameroon by the dominant French-speaking region under the dictatorial government of Paul Biya, who's been president/dictator for 40 years now, backed by the French. Mineral-rich country, oil-rich country. So Paul Biya has a blank check. He's 89 years old. He's essentially been in power for 47 years because before he became president in 1982, he had been prime minister under President Amadou Ahidjo. Essentially, this 89-year-old man lives in a luxury hotel suite in Switzerland. And that's where he runs the country from. So that is why he has no concern at all that his armed forces have been conducting a genocidal war against the southern English-speaking region, the most marginalized part of the country. Parts of what is now Cameroon had been ruled by the French during colonial era, and the other part by the British. I won't devote much time to that history today because I actually want to devote an entire podcast to discuss Cameroon and to discuss one of its nationalist heroes, Felix Mumi, who was their version of Patrice Lumumba. Patrice Lumumba was, of course, murdered by the Belgians with the involvement of the United States and the CIA. In the case of Cameroon, Mumi was murdered by poisoning, by lithium, by the French. I'm going to devote a podcast on that topic. So that is all I want to say today with regard to Cameroon and its total marginalization by global media when it comes to the conflict in that country, primarily because the French, of course, is trying to conceal what has been a genocidal war of several years now in Cameroon. A final observation that I'd like to make in terms of the agonizing cost with respect to Africa when it comes to the Russian war on Ukraine. So when there was a vote on March the 2nd at the United Nations General Assembly demanding that Russia observe a ceasefire after the invasion of Ukraine, many African countries either abstained or did not vote at all. Obviously, the African countries were concerned about aggravating Russia because many of them have now a growing relationship with Russia as well as with China to try to diminish their dependence on the United States, Britain, and the other Western countries. So now we are in a position very similar to the 1960s once again. Obviously, at that time, it was the United States and its Western allies versus the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc countries. Today, It is the United States and its Western allies, the NATO nations, versus Russia. So recently, the United States, through the State Department, informed African countries that they have to take an aggressive position in regards to the Russian war on Ukraine if they hope to get any financial relief. And many of them need financial relief because of the global repercussions on the global economy of this war in terms of rising fuel prices, in terms of rising grains. Senegal, for example, imports 57% of its wheat from Russia and Ukraine. So obviously there's an impact on that. And they're going to have to find a way to subsidize the increased cost of this grain for the people of Senegal. And that is a factor. And then, of course, all of them are impacted by the increased cost of fuel. So the United States is now dangling money either directly from the United States or indirectly through the World Bank and the IMF. And of course, both institutions are controlled by the United States. So African countries now are in the same position they were in shortly after winning formal independence in the early 1960s. You're either with the United States and its allies, or you're against them. And that is the dilemma that once again they have to deal with. Either choice that they make has some consequences. Right now, the Russian economy is under tremendous pressure. So many African countries might choose to lean with the United States in order to get resources from the World Bank and the IMF. And the United States, of course, is the major shareholder in both of these institutions. Now, I want to point out one other irony in terms of the anti-African racism that we've witnessed in this conflict. In the 1960s, the excuse of wanting to rescue Europeans, rescue whites who found themselves in positions of conflict in African countries. That excuse, of course, was used as a way to undermine, hijack, reverse the liberation and independence of African countries. And the best example, of course, was the Congo, where shortly after independence in June 1960, the Belgians instigated secession of the Katanga region, the most critical region, mineral resource region in the Congo, using the puppet Moise Tshombe, and then used the excuse of the turmoil that erupted in terms of the civil conflict between the national government of Patrice Lumumba and the secessionist region, essentially controlled by Belgium, but administrated by their African face, Tshombe, used that excuse to land Belgian NATO troops back in the Congo, led to the collapse of Lumumba's government, led to his arrest by Mobutu, who, unknown to Lumumba by that time, was actually on the payroll of the Central Intelligence Agency, led to the killings of many Africans by the Belgian soldiers and European mercenaries that accompanied them, and to the virtual, practical recolonization of the Congo, and plunge Congo into its new misery. And I say new misery because the colonial misery had not yet ended. And of course, many of you are familiar with the history, know that under the genocidal regime of King Leopold of the Belgians, more than 10 million Congolese are estimated to have perished. And then soon after independence, you have this new turmoil from which Congo has never really recovered from. So that is the irony. Europeans in a war situation, not discriminated against. In fact, many were being assisted to get out of the conflict. But nonetheless, the Belgians used that as an excuse to recolonize the Congo. And then we move to our contemporary era, when we see Africans in a position of conflict in a European country. Instead of being assisted to get out of the conflict, being discriminated against. In fact, many were being told that they would be kept, at least the males, kept in Ukraine so that they could fight against the Russians. And that also explains, of course, why subsequently they went to other African countries like Nigeria, like Senegal, like South Africa, to try to recruit Africans to go and fight in this war. In other words, the lives of Africans to them is of no value. So I want to close. I think those were some of the major contradictions in this conflict as it impacts Africa that I wanted to point out. And obviously, when I talk about the 1960s and Congo, once again, I have to remind you of my suggestions from the last podcast. The book, White Malice by Susan Williams, The CIA and the Covert Recolonization of Africa. It really is a tremendous, tremendous book. It's a tremendous book, as I said in the last podcast, and I assure you, you will not be disappointed if you decide to invest in this book. So in my next podcast, I will discuss Felix Mumi, the nationalist leader, and as I said, Cameroon's version of Patrice Lumumba. And he actually got to meet Patrice Lumumba. He got to meet Kwame Nkrumah. And Cameroon would have had definitely a very different history had Felix Mumi not been poisoned and murdered by the French. So also some people have contacted me through my publication, Black Star News, to try to get my contact. So today I want to provide it as I close off. You can follow me at Ali Mahdi on Twitter. And my publication, of course, is blackstarnews.com. And on my website, you'll also find my contact information if you wanted to get in touch with me. Otherwise, it's Ali Mahdi, just MALLIMADI @gmail.com. And of course, I welcome all support on our Patreon page, African History Club. So thank you, everybody, for your support. Stay well, stay safe, and remain Pan-African. Thank you.